A fugitive, desperate to evade arrest, tried blending in with a crowd of tourists, but when he spotted a screwdriver, he made a reckless move, charging straight at a royal guard. What followed stunned everyone in the palace courtyard. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment below, letting us know where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we're bringing you another powerful tale of courage and discipline from the royal guards. You won't want to miss it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered in their usual clusters, cameras clicking and voices chattering in a dozen languages. Among the crowd, children pressed their faces against the wrought iron gates while parents struggled to maintain order, everyone hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Queen's Guard in their iconic scarlet tunics and towering bearskin hats. Standing motionless at his post, Corporal Hayes embodied centuries of British military tradition. To the casual observer, he appeared as nothing more than a ceremonial figure, living statue adorned in an elaborate costume designed to impress tourists and photographers. His rifle, though real, seemed more prop than weapon. His expression, hidden beneath the shadow of his bearskin, gave away nothing of the razor-sharp awareness that coursed through every fiber of his being. But Hayes was no mere ornament. Beneath that scarlet wool lay the hardened physique of a man who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless classified operations that would never appear in any official record. The tourists saw pageantry. What they couldn't see was the coiled spring of violence that lay dormant within every Queen's Guard, ready to unleash hell at a moment's notice. The crowd thickened as the morning progressed, a sea of smartphones and selfie sticks, creating a chaotic backdrop against the palace's stoic grandeur. Street vendors called out their wares, tour guides recited well-rehearsed speeches about royal history, and the general cacophony of London tourism filled the air. Yet through it all, Hayes remained perfectly still, his eyes constantly scanning, cataloguing every face, every movement, every potential threat that moved within his field of vision. It was then that Ignacio Vara emerged from the crowd. At 34, Vara carried himself with the twitchy desperation of a man running from demons both real and imagined. His pupils were dilated despite the bright morning sun, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his pale forehead. The cheap hoodie he wore hung loosely on his gaunt frame, doing little to conceal the nervous energy that radiated from every pore. Vara's story was one written in violence and addiction. Born in the slums of Belgrade, he had clawed his way up through the ranks of the Balkan cartel hierarchy, earning his stripes through brutal efficiency and a complete disregard for human life. The intricate tattoo that snaked across his chest and shoulders told the story of his crimes, each symbol representing a life taken, a territory claimed, a rival eliminated. But success in the criminal underworld is fleeting, and Vara's empire had crumbled as quickly as it had risen. Now he was a hunted man. Interpol had red notices out in 17 countries. The Russians wanted him dead for a botched arms deal in Chechnya. The Italians had placed a bounty on his head after he'd burned down a rival's warehouse in Naples. Even his own cartel had disowned him after a series of increasingly erratic decisions that had cost them millions and drawn unwanted attention from law enforcement across Europe. Vara's paranoid mind had convinced him that the only way to escape his pursuers was to commit an act so audacious, so spectacular, that it would either cement his legend or end his suffering entirely. The Queen's Guard, he reasoned, were nothing more than toy soldiers, living museum pieces, whose only purpose was to stand still and let tourists take pictures. Surely attacking one would be child's play, and the resulting media frenzy would make him infamous enough to bargain his way into witness protection or a new identity. He had been watching the guards for 3 days, studying their routines, convinced he had identified a pattern of vulnerability. What he failed to understand was that these men were among the most elite soldiers in the British Army, hand-picked not just for their physical prowess, but for their mental fortitude and combat experience. The ceremonial duties were an honor, bestowed only upon those who had proven themselves in the fires of actual warfare. Hayes, for his part, had noticed Vara on the first day. Something about the man's body language, the way his eyes darted nervously from guard to guard, had triggered every alarm bell in the veteran soldier's mind. Hayes had served in Basra during the height of the insurgency, where the ability to identify potential threats in a crowd had meant the difference between life and death. He had learned to read the subtle signs, the micro-expressions, the involuntary tells. the thousand tiny details that separated a harmless civilian from someone planning violence. The maintenance cart sat unattended near the palace gates, its tools scattered across a fold-out tray as a grounds crew worker took his morning break. Among the various implements lay a Phillips head screwdriver, its steel shaft catching the sunlight like a beacon. Vara's eyes locked onto it with the intensity of a predator spotting wounded prey. The crowd continued to surge around them, oblivious to the drama about to unfold. A family from Japan posed for photos while their youngest daughter waved enthusiastically at Hayes, hoping to elicit some reaction from the stoic guard. An elderly couple from Yorkshire debated whether guards were allowed to smile, their conversation carried away by the morning breeze. A group of university students from London passed around a flask, already celebrating the weekend despite the early hour. Vara's hand closed around the screwdriver with trembling fingers. The metal felt cold against his palm, solid and reassuring, in a way that nothing else in his life had been for months. This was his moment, his chance to reclaim some measure of control in a world that had spiraled completely beyond his grasp. He had killed before, many times, but always from a distance, or with the element of surprise firmly on his side. This would be different. This would be personal. Hayes tracked the movement without shifting his gaze or adjusting his stance. Years of combat experience had taught him to use his peripheral vision like a radar system, monitoring threats while maintaining the appearance of complete indifference. He had already calculated the distance between himself and Vara, identified the weapon, and formulated at least 3 different response scenarios depending on the angle and timing of the attack. The moment stretched like taffy, seconds, feeling like hours as Vara worked up the courage to make his move. Around them, London continued, its relentless pace read. Double-decker buses rumbled past on the street beyond. Pigeons pecked at crumbs scattered by generous tourists, and the distant chimes of Big Ben marked the passage of time with mechanical precision. A nearby tourist, a middle-aged man from Manchester wearing a football jersey and carrying a pint despite the early hour, laughed loudly at his own joke. "Look at these toy soldiers," he declared to his embarrassed wife, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Bet they'd faint if someone actually tried to fight them. Probably never seen real combat in their lives, just standing around looking pretty for the cameras." His words were the final catalyst Vara needed. With a strangled cry that was part battle roar and part desperate sob, he lunged forward. The screwdriver raised high above his head like a dagger. The polished steel caught the morning light as it arced toward Hayes' exposed neck, aimed at the narrow gap between his collar and the bottom edge of his bearskin hat. For a split second, the entire courtyard seemed to freeze. The tourist with his ignorant commentary stood slack-jawed as he realized his words had preceded actual violence. The Japanese family stopped mid-pose. Their youngest daughters waved dying in mid-move. Even the pigeons seemed to pause in their endless search for crumbs, as if nature itself held its breath for what was to come. But Hayes was already moving. The response was so swift, so perfectly executed, that most observers would later swear they had missed it entirely. Hayes' rifle, which had appeared to be nothing more than a ceremonial prop, snapped upward with mechanical precision. The wooden stock connected with Vara's wrist with a sickening crack that echoed off the palace walls like a gunshot. The screwdriver never completed its deadly arc. Instead, it tumbled end over end through the air, its trajectory altered by the devastating impact that had shattered Vara's radius and owner in 3 places. The would-be assassin's scream of pain was cut short as Hayes' follow-up movement swept his legs from beneath him, sending his broken body crashing onto the unforgiving cobblestones with a wet thud that would haunt the nightmares of every witness. The entire sequence had taken exactly 1.3 seconds less time than it takes to blink twice. Hayes had identified the threat, calculated the optimal response, and executed a textbook close-quarters combat maneuver without so much as tilting his bearskin hat. Even as Vara writhed on the ground, clutching his shattered wrist and gasping for breath, Hayes was already returning to his original position, his breathing steady and his expression unchanged. The crowd erupted into chaos. Children began crying as their parents pulled them back from the violence. Cameras swung wildly as tourists tried to capture footage of the aftermath. Someone screamed for a doctor while another voice called for police, though both were unnecessary. Security had been watching the entire incident unfold and were already responding with military efficiency. Within seconds, Plainclothes protection officers materialized from seemingly nowhere, surrounding Vara with weapons drawn while palace guards maintained their positions with parade ground precision. The transformation was remarkable. What had appeared to be a tourist attraction moments before was revealed to be a fortress defended by some of the most elite soldiers in the world. As metropolitan police units arrived with sirens wailing, the true scope of Vara's folly began to emerge. The investigating officers quickly discovered that Hayes' seemingly instantaneous response had been anything but improvised. The corporal's service record painted the picture of a warrior forged in the crucible of modern warfare, a man who had earned his scarlet tunic through blood and steel, rather than ceremony and tradition. Hayes had enlisted at 18, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and the kind of restless energy that could only be channeled through military service. His first deployment to Afghanistan had been a baptism by fire, arriving just as coalition forces were pushing into Taliban strongholds in Helmand province. It was there that he had first learned the deadly calculus of close-quarters combat, where hesitation measured in milliseconds could mean the difference between returning home or coming back in a flag-draped coffin. The young soldier had distinguished himself during a particularly brutal engagement near Sangin, where his unit had been pinned down by insurgent fire for nearly 6 hours. When their position was finally overrun, Hayes had found himself in hand-to-hand combat with 3 Taliban fighters, armed with nothing but his sidearm and the combat training that had been drilled into him at Katarik garrison. He had emerged, victorious but changed, carrying scars both visible and hidden that would mark him for the rest of his life. His second tour had taken him to Iraq, where the urban warfare of Basra presented an entirely different set of challenges. Here, the enemy could be anyone. A shopkeeper selling fruit in the morning might be planting IEDs by evening. Hayes had learned to read the subtle signs of deception, to identify threats in crowds of seemingly innocent civilians, and to respond with lethal precision when violence erupted without warning. It was during his final deployment that Hayes had faced his greatest test. Intelligence reports had identified a bomb-making cell operating out of a residential neighborhood, and Hayes' unit had been tasked with a pre-dawn raid to capture the suspects before they could complete their deadly work. The mission had gone sideways from the moment they breached the door, with the insurgents having prepared a complex ambush that turned the narrow streets into a killing field. Hayes had found himself separated from his unit, alone in a maze of alleyways with enemy fighters closing in from all directions. It was then that his training truly paid dividends, as he employed every technique he had learned to evade, capture, and eliminate threats one by one. The engagement lasted for nearly 4 hours, with Hayes using improvised weapons, environmental advantages, and pure determination to survive against overwhelming odds. When rescue finally arrived, they found him standing over the bodies of 6 insurgents, his uniform torn and bloodied but his spirit unbroken. The citation for his military cross would later describe his actions as exemplifying the highest traditions of courage and selfless devotion to duty. But the words could never capture the psychological toll of that night, or the way it had hardened him into something approaching a human weapon. The transition to ceremonial duties might have seemed like a step backward to an outside observer, but for Hayes it represented the pinnacle of military achievement. Only the most trusted and capable soldiers were selected for the Queen's Guard, tasked with protecting not just the royal family but the very symbols of British sovereignty and tradition. As Vara was loaded into an ambulance, his shattered wrist immobilized and his face pale with shock and pain medication, the full extent of his criminal history began to emerge through police databases and Interpol communications. The man who had thought to attack what he perceived as a ceremonial toy soldier was revealed to be one of Europe's most wanted fugitives, with arrest warrants spanning 3 continents and a rap sheet that read like a catalogue of modern criminality. His involvement with the Balkan cartels had begun in his teens, when the collapse of Yugoslavia had created a power vacuum filled by organized crime syndicates. Vara had proven himself useful for his complete lack of conscience and his willingness to undertake assignments that even hardened criminals found distasteful. His first kill had come at 19, when he had strangled a rival gang member with his bare hands over a disputed drug territory worth less than £1,000. From there, his reputation had grown along with his body count. He had orchestrated kidnappings in Prague, run human trafficking operations through the Balkans, and laundered money for terrorist organizations operating throughout the Middle East. The tattoos that covered his torso were not mere decoration, but a detailed record of his crimes, each symbol representing a specific act of violence or a territory under his control. But success in the criminal underworld is built on shifting alliances and constant betrayal, and Vara's empire had begun to crumble when he made the fatal mistake of skimming money from a shipment of weapons destined for Chechen separatists. The Russians had not taken kindly to being robbed, and their response had been swift and decisive. Within weeks, Vara's lieutenants were disappearing one by one, their bodies turning up in increasingly creative displays of violence, designed to send a message to anyone else considering similar betrayals. The investigation would later reveal that Vara's attack on Hayes had been born not of careful planning, but of desperate psychosis brought on by months of paranoid fugitive existence. Security footage from across London showed him wandering the streets for weeks, sleeping in doorways and scrounging for food, while constantly looking over his shoulder for assassins, who might or might not have been real. His decision to target Buckingham Palace appeared to have been made on impulse, driven by a delusional belief that attacking a symbol of British authority would somehow restore his reputation and provide him with the notoriety needed to negotiate his way out of the web of enemies closing in around him. What he had failed to understand was that the men guarding the palace were not symbols or ceremonies but warriors, whose ceremonial duties masked years of combat experience and training that had prepared them for exactly this type of encounter. The screwdriver that had been his weapon of choice was now displayed in the Guards Museum, labeled as Exhibit 47. When ceremony meets combat, visitors would often pause to read the placard describing the incident, most unable to comprehend how quickly and decisively trained soldiers could respond to threats that seemed to emerge from nowhere. For Hayes, the incident was simply another day at work, a brief interruption in the ceremonial duties that he took as seriously as any combat mission he had undertaken in foreign lands. By noon, he was back at his post, standing with the same motionless precision that had characterized his vigil before Vara's attack. The only sign that anything had happened was a slight reddening on his knuckles, where they had connected with the would-be assassin's wrist, a mark that would fade within hours. The Japanese family that had been posing for photos during the attack approached cautiously, their youngest daughter still clutching her father's hand with wide, frightened eyes. The child had been traumatized by the sudden violence, unable to understand how someone could try to hurt the nice soldier who had waved back at her earlier that morning. With her parents' encouragement, she stepped forward and offered Hayes a small ice cream cone that had somehow survived the chaos, a gesture of innocent kindness that seemed to bridge the gap between the brutal realities of his profession and the peaceful world he was sworn to protect. Hayes' eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the only indication of emotion he allowed himself while on duty, as he accepted the gift with a subtle nod of appreciation. The image would later be captured by a photographer from the Times, becoming an iconic representation of the duality that defined the modern Queen's Guard warriors, capable of deadly violence, who could still find humanity in the smile of a child. The photograph would hang in the Guards Museum alongside the screwdriver, a reminder that beneath the ceremony and tradition lay men who had seen the worst of humanity, yet chose to protect the best of it. As the afternoon wore on and the crowds returned to their normal patterns of tourism and photography, the incident began to fade into the background noise of London life. But for those who had witnessed it, the lesson was clear: the quiet professionals who stood guard over Britain's most treasured institutions were far more than ceremonial decorations. They were the inheritors of a warrior tradition that stretched back centuries, men who had proven themselves in the crucible of modern warfare and stood ready to defend their charges with the same deadly efficiency their predecessors had shown. On battlefields from Waterloo to the Somme, the scarlet tunics and bearskin hats were symbols of that tradition. But beneath the ceremony lay the steel of men who had earned their positions through courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to duty that transcended mere pageantry. When ceremony met combat, as it had that morning at Buckingham Palace, there was never any doubt about the outcome. Some men wear armor to protect themselves, others simply become armor to protect everyone else.